My mother had 6 children. I was the second. And if you had stood us all in a row the way we stood for photographs at weddings, the rare photographs that were permitted, you would have seen the same face repeated 6 times, with small variations. My father's jaw, my mother's forehead, the dark brown hair that ran through her family like a thread pulled from the same spool for 3 generations. We were unmistakably one thing, one line, one blood, one family, shaped by the same valley, the same prayers, the same table, the same God. And then there was Daniel. Daniel was the 4th child. He arrived when I was 7 years old, and I remember my mother bringing him out to show us in the way she had shown us all the babies, wrapped in the white cloth, face turned up toward whatever light was coming through the window. But I remember also that something moved through the room that I could not name at 7 and have spent decades since trying to find words for. My oldest brother looked at Daniel and then looked at my father, and my father was looking at the wall, not at Daniel, at the wall. And my mother held Daniel a little closer and said, "Come and see." And we came, and we saw, and no one said anything about what we were all already beginning to understand. Daniel had red hair, not auburn, not a reddish-brown that could be explained by some distant relation or a trick of the light. Red. The particular red that belongs to a specific kind of person, bright and unapologetic, completely its own. His skin was fair in a way that made the Amish sun his enemy every summer. His eyes were green, clear, light green, the color of new grass in April. There was not a single person on my father's side, not a single person on my mother's side, going back as far as anyone could remember or trace, who had looked anything like Daniel. Before I go any further, I need to stop and say something honest to you. More than 90% of the people watching this right now have not subscribed yet. And perhaps that would not matter so much if these were just stories. But they are not just stories. They are the silences that shaped me. They are the things that were never allowed to be said out loud in the house where I grew up. If something in what I am telling you tonight is reaching something that lives quietly in you, please subscribe before we go further. It is completely free. It keeps this community alive. It means these truths keep getting told. And while you are here, tell me something in the comments. What is the one memory you find yourself returning to over and over again? I want to know. I read everything you write, every single word, without exception. No one in our community said anything directly. I want you to understand how completely that sentence captures the world I grew up in. No one said anything directly about anything that mattered. Difficult things move through our community the way weather moves through a valley. You could feel it coming. You could feel it arrive. You could feel it change the quality of the air around you. But no one pointed at it and named it. To name it would have been to make it real in a way that required a response. And our community did not have a response for something like Daniel. So the thing that Daniel was, the question he represented simply by existing, moved through the district in whispers and long looks, and the particular silence that falls when a subject is both completely known and completely forbidden. My mother's name was Ruth. She was a small woman, fine-boned and quick, with hands that were never still and a mind that moved faster than she was ever permitted to use it. She had been raised in a family that valued obedience above every other virtue. Her father was a minister. Her mother was the kind of woman who had been so thoroughly shaped by her world that she seemed to have no edges of her own left, only the edges of the community pressing in from all sides, defining her outline. My mother had grown up in that household and married my father at 19 and moved into the farmhouse where she would spend the rest of her life, and had begun the work of becoming the woman her world required her to be. But there were things about my mother that did not fit the outline. I noticed them the way you notice the places where a hem has been let down and then taken back up again. You can see where it was, even if it no longer is. She read more than the other women in our district. Not forbidden books. There were no forbidden books in the open. But she read thoroughly, carefully, with an attention that suggested she was looking for something specific. She asked questions that made the men at the table go quiet in a way that was not entirely comfortable. She had opinions about things women in our community were not supposed to have opinions about, and she expressed them rarely and only in private, but she had them. She was, underneath everything the community had built over her, a person, a full and complicated person. And I think that is important to understand before anything else. I was 14 when I first heard someone say it plainly. It was not said to me. I was in the barn, and two women from the district were in the yard below the window, and they did not know I was there. And one of them said the name of an Englishman I did not recognize, followed by a sentence I have never forgotten. She said, "Everyone knew except Amos." My father's name was Amos, and then the other woman made the sound of someone who does not want to continue the conversation, and they moved away, and I sat in the hay for a long time without moving, and the world made a different shape around me than it had made before. I did not speak of it, not to my mother, not to my sisters, not to anyone. I was 14, and I lived inside a world that had no container for this. And I understood even at 14 that to speak it would be to break something that could not be put back together. So I learned what my mother had been practicing my whole life. I learned to keep my face smooth and my hands busy, and my knowledge of a thing entirely separate from my expression of that thing. I learned the particular discipline of carrying what you know in a place no one else can see. Daniel grew up strange to himself in ways I understood only later. He was bright, brighter than the rest of us, quicker with numbers, curious in a way that the community schooling could not fully contain. He was also lonely in a way that was hard to name, because he was surrounded constantly by family and community, and there was never a moment of physical solitude, and yet he was lonely. I think now that what he was lonely for was an explanation, for a reflection, for some mirror that would show him where he came from in a way that made sense of the face he saw in the water trough every morning. That red hair, those green eyes, that particular person who did not match the family photograph. He never asked my mother. I know this because I asked him once, years later, when we were both out of the community and living in the same city and having the conversations we could never have had at home. I said, "Did you ever ask her directly?" And he said no. And I said, "Why not?" And he was quiet for a moment, and then he said, "Because I was afraid that if I asked her, she would have to lie to me." And I think I would rather have had her silence than her lie. That answer has stayed with me for a long time. The idea that silence can be a form of protection. The idea that a mother's refusal to speak can be the most honest thing she is capable of offering. I have turned it over many times in the years since, trying to decide if I believe it, trying to decide if the silence was mercy or cowardice, or simply the only option available to a woman who had no other options. I have not decided. I think perhaps all three were true at once. The Englishman's name, I learned eventually, was not something I will say here. He had been connected to a business my father used occasionally for supplies in the years before Daniel was born. He had left the area before Daniel arrived. Whether he knew, whether anyone told him, whether he ever understood what his presence in that valley had produced, I do not know. I have thought about finding out. I have decided not to. Daniel has decided not to. Some doors are better left with their latches down, not because the truth behind them does not exist, but because you are not certain you can survive what you find when you open them. My mother spent the rest of her life being Ruth, being my father's wife, being a member of the community, being the woman who raised 6 children and kept a clean house and put up preserves in the fall and sat in the same pew every Sunday morning for 50 years. She was good at it. I want to say that clearly and without bitterness because I think it is true. She was genuinely good at the life she lived. She loved my father in the way long marriages produce love, steadily, practically, without drama. The love of 2 people who have eaten at the same table and slept in the same bed and weathered the same winters for decades until the boundary between 2 people becomes something more like a shoreline than a wall. And she loved Daniel. This I am certain of. The way she loved him was not different in kind from the way she loved the rest of us, but it was different in quality, as if it came from a deeper and more frightened place, as if every time she looked at him, she was aware of a cost that the rest of us could not see. She protected him in ways that were subtle enough that I only understood them in retrospect. When the community's attention turned toward Daniel in ways that were uncomfortable, she redirected it with a skill that I recognize now as the skill of a woman who has been managing dangerous attention her whole life. She was always between him and harm, always, not obviously, not in ways that drew more notice, but always. She died on a Wednesday in October. She had been unwell for several weeks but had refused to be a burden about it, which was entirely consistent with who she was. My youngest sister found her in the morning, still in bed, which was itself unusual. My mother was always the first one up. She had gone in the night quietly, the doctor said. Probably her heart. She was 74. Daniel drove through the night to get there. I watched him walk into the house where we had grown up, and I watched him stand in the doorway of the room where she had spent so many years of her life. And I watched him look at her, and then look away, and then look back. He stood there for a long time without moving. No one disturbed him. Even the members of the community who were present, and who had their complicated feelings about Daniel, no one disturbed him. There are moments when grief makes a space around itself that even disapproval cannot enter. We buried her on a Friday, plain service, plain grave. The bishop spoke about her faithfulness, about her service to the community, about her gentle and steady presence over the decades. All of it was true. None of it was the whole truth. The whole truth was in the box we were lowering into the ground with her, where it had always been, where she had kept it for 40 years. Afterward, Daniel and I stood at the edge of the field behind the house. The October light was low and amber, and the stubble of the harvested corn caught it in a way that made the whole field look like something lit from underneath. He said, "Do you think she wanted to tell us?" I said, "I think she wanted to many times." He said, "Do you think she was afraid?" I said, "Yes." He said, "Of what?" And I thought about it for a long time before I answered. I said, "I think she was afraid of what it would cost you to know. I think she believed that the not knowing was a kind of shelter she could give you, even if the shelter had walls you could feel without being able to see." He did not say anything for a moment. Then he said, "I always felt the walls." I said, "I know." He said, "I would have rather known." I said, "I know that too." I do not tell this story because I have resolved it. I tell it because it is not resolved, and I think there is honesty in that. I think there is something important in saying that some stories do not end with understanding. Some stories end with an October field and a freshly turned grave, and two people standing in amber light trying to figure out what to do with a silence that is now permanent, because the only person who could have broken it has taken it somewhere unreachable. My mother raised a child that looked nothing like any of us. She raised him with the same hands that made the bread and hemmed the dresses and folded 50 years of laundry. She loved him in whatever complicated way a woman loves the living evidence of the part of herself she was never permitted to acknowledge. And she died without explaining because explanation would have required a language she was never given, in a world that would have destroyed her for speaking it. I have been angry about the silence. I have been grateful for the love inside it. I have held both at the same time and found that they do not cancel each other out. They simply exist together, the way grief and love always exist together, inseparable, each one the proof of the other. If you grew up in a family that kept a silence so large it had its own gravity, I see you. If you spent your childhood sensing the shape of something you were not permitted to name, I see you. If you have ever stood at a grave knowing the most important conversation was the one that never happened, I see you. You were not wrong to feel the walls. You were not wrong to want the truth. And the love that came wrapped in silence was still love, even when the silence was its own kind of wound. Some of us inherit the truth. Some of us inherit the silence around the truth. And some of us spend the rest of our lives learning how to tell the difference and deciding, slowly, what we want to say out loud. Before you leave, I want to thank you for staying with me all the way to the end of this. I know there are millions of videos you could have spent this time with tonight, and you chose to spend it here, with my mother and Daniel, and the silence that lived in our house for 40 years. That means something I cannot put into simple words. But I want to be honest with you about something. More than 90% of the people who watch these videos have still not subscribed. And if this story touched something in you, If it reminded you of a silence in your own family, a question that was never answered, a person who was never fully explained, I hope you will subscribe before you go. It is free, it takes 1 second, and it means these stories keep being told, the ones that live too long in the dark. Tell me in the comments what part of this stayed with you. Tell me about the silence you grew up inside, if you are ready to say it. Or simply tell me you were here tonight. I read every word, every single one. Until next time, remember this: the silence that was kept around you was never the whole truth, and you are allowed to keep looking for the rest of it.